Can you guys hear me all right? Microphone is working? Hooray! Okay, fantastic. I want to welcome everybody to tonight's reading and talk by the amazing Menendez. The title is Writing in Interesting Times, and this talk is organized by the Susan Glaspell Writers and Critics Reading Series, which is generously funded by the Drake University Center for the Humanities. Usually when I introduce an author, I tend to like to say, okay, here's the author, and I run away. If you've seen me give an introduction, you know I don't usually begin with a story of my own, but this is a little bit different. In 2003, I was forced to move to San Francisco. Horrible fate, I know. But it was not something I terribly much wanted to do at the time. My family was very far away in Florida. I missed them tremendously. And the ocean was on the wrong side, which is something you will only understand if you've ever lived on the coast. It's very disorienting. It's wrong. The universe is wrong. I moved there to be with somebody else because he was the love of my life. And it was the right decision, but it was a hard decision because he had reasons to be there, and I did not. He had, a Stegner Fellowship. He had an institutional affiliation. He had fellow fellows. We actually called them Steg folk. At the time, he had steg folk, and he had, invitations to parties and readings and things, and I had none of these. I only had him. I made the best of it. I got a job at a brewery. I recommend that course of action, incidentally. The brewery let me take home a case of beer every week. San Francisco was expensive, so that case of beer was essentially my entertainment for the time that I lived there. The beer was good, I was in love, and though it was always cold and damp and dreary, I kept myself warm with dreams and memories of home. One day, I was walking down Valencia Street. If you've ever been there, you know there's lots of great bookstores on Valencia Street in San Francisco. I was visiting those bookstores. It was a gray day, I remember it. Gray sky, gray street. Knowing that it was Valencia Street, actually probably half of the buildings were aquamarine and the other half were pink, but in my memory, it was gray. So let me take you there in my memory, to this gray, gray place. And as I was walking down the street, I looked into one of the windows and I saw this shock of yellow sunshine coming towards me. Yellow book, palm trees, a bright bird. It reminded me of home, and best of all was its title, In Cuba I Was a German Shepherd. In part probably because I grew up in South Florida and I've known a few Cubans in my time, I think I understood the joke to a certain extent before I even read the story. When I was there, I was this big deal, sleek and strong and serious, and now I'm just this little yippy thing. How are you going to take me seriously? It's probably inappropriate to compare a few years of longing for home to the loss of property, freedom, life, and livelihood that characterizes the Cuban diaspora, but I was in my 20s, so there you go. And there were other reasons that I really needed to be home at that time. This book was sunlight for me in that rain and in that fog. It transported me in the way that only a book can do. It was not just that it was set mostly in Florida or that it painted pictures of home, but it was also that it painted pictures of exile as a universal concept, separation, heartache, homesickness, that slow motion sense of loss that never falls completely into the past tense, that is always losing and never quite having lost. And then I found out she had a second book. So this is how I became such an enormous fan of Ana Menendez. Loving Che, I think came out the year I read
or the next,
first book. So I got to read the two in pretty quick succession. And I fell in love with this book as well, so much so that when I did move back to Florida and started teaching at a university there, I taught this book to my students. It was one of the first things I did. And then The Last War came out. I'm just going to do a show and tell now. When this book came out, I actually sought Ana out and interviewed her for the Rumpus, and then I was beyond thrilled when I found out that HarperCollins actually wanted to include that interview in the paperback edition. So if you buy this edition, the paperback edition, you can actually read my interview with Ana in the back, which is, it means a lot to me, obviously, to be a part of your book and its history in that way. Finally, I received an advanced copy of Adios Happy Homeland, and it was like the sky opened up. The book is influenced by Borges and Calvino. These are some of my favorite authors. All of her books are incredibly different from one another, but this book was a book apart, even considering that, and it was just a joy to read every time I've read it, which is probably going on 6 or 7 times now. It's a clever book, challenging, experimental, and I would argue even sort of interactive, sort of a game in addition to being a book. It has taken its place as one of my favorite books of all time. I hope that it has done the same or will do the same for you. But I also know that Anna is working on book number 5, so brace yourself, because something new, something fantastic and new is about to happen. It is for these reasons that it is with nothing short of absolute joy that I introduce to you the great writer, journalist, and human being, Ana Menendez.
I don't think I've ever had a lovelier introduction. Thank you. I'm at a loss. I feel like I should sit down and just let you keep talking. Thank you so much. I didn't know that story of how you came up across in Cuba. It's very moving, and it's what every writer, I think, hopes for. So thank you for that gift. This cover was painted by a painter that I knew in New Delhi. She's a Korean painter, Kim Young-min, and I knew her before I even started writing this book, and I loved this painting before I even started writing the book. And when the book was bought by Grove Atlantic, I said, I have the perfect idea for a cover, and there's this big groan, because I think, you know, they hate to hear author input on covers, and it's like, we don't know anything, and you know, they were afraid I would say something like, I can draw it, or something. But they also fell in love with it, and I have lost touch with her, but a couple of years ago I heard from her husband, who wanted to thank me profusely because she was still getting royalties from it. So I thought that was really great. And incidentally, I'm kind to my friends, because this cover was by another fantastic woman artist that I know, Lindsay Adario, who has since become quite famous. She is a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, and she has a wonderful, wonderful book out about being a war photographer as a mother, as a woman. I can't remember the name of it right now, but she had a great piece in the New York Times magazine about it. So, yeah, well, thank you. I'm digressing, as I tend to do. Well, I'm talking today about a couple of things, but since I'm primarily going to talk about story and storytelling, I'll start with one. And it's a story that some of you may have heard before, but it starts with about 40,000 tons of nuclear waste. And there's nuclear waste that's sitting around, and the government doesn't quite know what to do with it. And there were plans afoot some years back to bury it under Yucca Mountains, or Yucca Mountains, as I've heard locals call it, in Nevada. And this presented a problem, because this stuff is lethal. And keeping people away from the site now is no problem, but it will be lethal for 10,000 years. And so the problem that the nuclear waste management department faced was, how do we warn people away from this site 10,000 years into the future? And this is no small question, because you can't count on English surviving, of course. You can't count on electrical impulses surviving, all those things. So they hired a linguist. Is anybody studying linguistics here? Any linguistics major? It could be a very exciting career. They hired a linguist called Thomas Shibowick. And he did a report. They said, we want you to figure out how best to warn people away from the site 10,000 years into the future. And so he studied the problem for a long time, thought about it for a long time, and he came back and he said, look, signs are not going to work, because language is very contextual, and you know, humanity lost the ability to read hieroglyphics in just a couple generations. You can't do smells. Smells don't last. You can't do ideograms because that loses meaning as well. You know, we may think a skull and bones means danger, but there's no guarantee that that's going to mean anything at all to any future generations. So he concluded that the only thing that nuclear waste management could do was to establish a kind of atomic priesthood that would spread the story from generation to generation orally as a story. And he said that was the only way that you can ensure that this story would stay alive 10,000 years. It would change, for sure. Each generation would shape it, but it would, the essential message, which the essential taboo, would remain. And that was the only way to ensure humanity's safety so many generations into the future. Now, they're still arguing about where they're going to put this stuff, and that never came to be, at least not yet. But I love that story. Umberto Eco writes about it in The Search for the Perfect Language, which is a great book. I highly recommend it. And it's one of very interesting stories that he tells. But I've always loved that story, and it's always stayed with me because it tells about the power of story. It's something that we have always engaged in. Long before we figured out writing, long before we invented the alphabet, we were telling stories. And it continues to have this sort of life-saving property. And so the talk that I'm giving tonight has this kind of funny and also grandiose title, right? Writing in Interesting Times, which yeah, when you think about the hundreds of writers that are imprisoned around the world, the hundreds of writers that are killed every year. Just this month, there were 2 journalists murdered in Guatemala on March 10th. Danilo Lopez of La Prensa and Federico Salazar for their reporting. So writers face real challenges today, as they always have. It's a powerful thing to do, and therefore it's dangerous. So it seems a little funny that I would, a little bit grandiose to call this Writing in Interesting Times when what I'm talking about is the challenges faced by the internet, right? So keep that in mind, keep it in perspective as I go on. But they are also challenging times for writers in peaceful areas. And it is still a danger to democracy what is happening to journalism. The state of journalism it's in a death spiral. We don't know if it will recover. I think it will. I have great hopes for it. But each year since 2007, newsrooms have lost between 2,000, sometimes as high as 5,000 reporters. Ad revenue for help wanted ads fell by 92% in 10 years. It went from 8.7 billion in 2000 to 723 million in 2010. So these are really stark, sad numbers, and they're not good news for people who want good reporting on corruption, who want politicians to be held accountable, right? The fragmentation of news sources has also, it's been good in some ways, it's been not so good in the sense that people just gravitate towards their ideological megaphone and leave it at that, right? So we are facing a lot of challenges, and you know, a lot of it boils down to the internet, right? And it's become kind of a boogeyman. And so my talk is, well, it's not a defense, but it's also not a tear down. I want to talk a little bit about what we can gain from it. And then I'll read a little bit also. I didn't want to read too much. When I first started writing, when my first book came out, my mom said, "Oh, but just don't read for very long. That's very boring for people." So I've never forgotten that. So I will read because I promise, but I hope not to bore you too much. But just like the invention of the printing press, and the invention of the alphabet, and the invention of writing, all of these technological advancements in writing make people nervous, right? That's our human nature. And so I'm going to read you a quote. The multitude of books is a great evil. There is no limit to this fever for writing. Everyone must be an author, some out of vanity to acquire celebrity and raise up a name, others for the sake of mere gain. Okay? It's easy to kind of say, right on, right? When you see Marco Rubio with a book, which my parents have in their library, a book by Marco Rubio. This was written by Martin Luther, himself a prolific writer of pamphlets, right? So even in that time, he was already bemoaning this excess of written material. And before that, Socrates was down on writing itself. He said he warned those who acquired the ability would stop exercising their memory and would become forgetful. Students would be inundated with information and would become, quote, filled with the conceit of wisdom instead of real wisdom and be a burden to society. Okay? So Socrates didn't think writing was so great either. What's ironic now is that the scaremongers about the internet are talking about how good the printed word is for the mind, right? This thing that was a great evil has now become a great good in the minds of the latest wave of people who are scared of this. So I don't know if any of you read in about, I think it was 2008, Nicholas Carr came out with an article in the Atlantic called "Is Google Making You Stupid?" Did any of you read this? It became very popular and people went back and forth. I'll quote from that. In it he wrote, "The net seems to be chipping away my capacity for concentration and contemplation." And then I think proving that Google had not eroded his capacity for really nice metaphors. He said, "Once I was a scuba diver in the sea of words. Now I zip along the surface like a guy on a jet ski." And he quoted Marianne Wolf, who's a developmental psychologist who's written a lot about this. And she said that the disjointed and shallow nature of internet writing may be, quote, weakening our capacity for the kind of deep reading that emerged with the printing press. Okay? Tell that to Martin Luther. So, as you see, there's always this kind of fear when there's a new technology related to storytelling. But, you know, the printing press didn't do away with handwritten letters. And books it did not erode our memory completely, right? And likewise, the rise of the internet has given us something. It's taken away, right? It takes away a lot. It's hurt newspapers. It may, in fact, be changing the way we read, maybe changing the way we write. It's made it more difficult to pay writers, okay? Because it's the same thing that's happening in the music industry now. Bootlegged books, which you can just download and not pay, right? And so this hurts writers because writers, you know, have children to feed and mortgages to pay, and if they're not paid, it makes it harder. It's not going to discourage them because it doesn't discourage them all over the world where writers don't get paid and continue to write. It doesn't discourage the poets who don't get paid and continue to write, right? So it's not going to put an end to it, but it does put pressure on the profession, and it will make changes. It will bring changes with it. But there are things that I think, possibilities that it's opened up in writing that are worth exploring and worth being excited about. And I think they're kind of threefold. One is the direct translation, right, from books to Kindle, for instance, where you have, I love my Kindle, by the way. I lived abroad for 5 years, and you know, it saved my life because I could get my books. I would read, I also became quite an impulse buyer. I would read a review and say, I want that book, and I would buy it. So I have a lot of friends who are writers who I love and respect, and they refuse to get one. They think it's Satan. And I don't agree. I think it's a great tool. I still also like to read real books. It doesn't mean that I don't have real books. I have a nice library at home. If it's poetry, I like to read it in a real book. So that's the first thing that's changed, right? Now you can get books all of a sudden. You can read a review, and you don't have to wait for the bookstore to open. You can buy it. I mean, how is that bad? I mean, I like that. Yes, it's hurting bookstores a little bit. They've adapted some of them. That's sad if bookstores disappear, because there is that serendipity of just walking into a bookstore without anything in mind and finding a cool book or having somebody talk to you about a cool book, you know, being Amy Letter and walking by and seeing a sunny cover, right? These are beautiful things that we wouldn't want to lose. So that's one thing that's changing. The other thing is a kind of writing that is new media, right? And I know that Amy teaches this. It's a new form, and it's very exciting. I mean, we are here present at the birth of a new form. And I think that's something to be excited about, not to be all grumpy and, you know, rah, 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 I want my real books. I like the way books smell, right? I hear that a lot. Yeah, okay, but so why not go with this new kind of form? And there's some really exciting stuff being done. At the beginning, it wasn't so exciting. At the beginning, it was kind of like hypertext, and you click on this, and it takes you somewhere, and it's not really very interesting. There was an experiment that I think, it was Penguin did with Google Maps, and does anybody remember this? I can't remember the name of it. Yeah, and that was kind of, yeah, I was underwhelmed personally when I saw that. You just click on something in the map, and then the little window would slowly open up. And, yeah, I think so also, right. Yeah, and it just wasn't interesting. I mean, you know, if I want to look at a map, I'll look at a map, and if I want to read a book, I'll read a book, and it just didn't work. But okay, this is how you start off, this is how you begin to experiment. But this has evolved already, and there's some really interesting things going on in this new genre that we are present at the birth of, and I think that's very exciting. I don't know if any of you have heard of Pry, this new sort of multimedia experience. It just won a bunch of big awards, and it's a book, but it's also video, and you pry it open. It's about a guy just back, a demolitions expert, I think, just back from the first Gulf War, and what goes on in his mind. He's going blind, and you're sort of privy to his mind, and you can pry open parts of the story to get at more information. So it's very interactive while being curated in a way. It's also a collaborative effort, which I think this is one of the nice things about the internet, is that it has reintroduced this collaborative storytelling, which is the way we always told stories. Most scholars agree that Homer wasn't one person who wrote that thing, those two, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but that it was a collection of people around the campfire every night, every generation, retelling and reworking and rehoning this story. And what's interesting to me, it's kind of fun to think about, is that the internet is returning us. It's killing the author, which is not such a bad thing, right? I mean, the author came about because of the printing press, because suddenly you could put your name on this product, you know, dash off a bunch of copies and sell them, and so now it was important. You wanted that money from that book. Before, storytelling was a community activity. It was not a money-making activity, and the internet is kind of returning us to that, for better or for worse, right? And you can also see that in another influence that I think the internet is having on storytelling, in online games. I think online games, I don't play them myself, but my husband used to play EVE Online before we had a child. And I was really struck when I saw him playing how much like the Odyssey it was, because you have a stock characters, you have your villains, you have your heroes, you have your trickster figures. it's almost like people just automatically in this. Does anybody ever play? Does anybody play EVE Online? These massive, online collaborative games. People play at the same time. So you could be sitting in Norway, at 3 o'clock in the morning, playing with somebody in Japan and somebody else in Seattle. Right, and you're playing in real time, and you're on adventures in real time, and they're creating. I mean, there's no reason to be snooty about what they're doing. I think if we look at it honestly, they are creating a story, and I think that's another fantastic tribute to story that this new age has given us, and very lovely at that. The third way that I think it's influencing writing is the way that it's touching even, the old standbys, paper books, because I think it will. I don't think it's anything that writers have consciously set out to do, but writers live in the world, and writers, when they're working honestly and when they're good, in the sense of being honest and hardworking and all of that, are living in the world that they are writing about. Even if they're writing historical fiction, even if it's science fiction, you are immersed in the daily life that you live. I remember I was a visiting writer in Middelburg in the Netherlands, and my way of teaching writing is bombarding students with a lot of reading. They're often a little bit disappointed because they think they're just going to come in and start writing poems. And I say, no writing, just reading. And I make them read just a bunch of classics. And one student at one point said to me, I'm really depressed, from what I'm reading. And I said, well, why? They're not that depressing, these stories, are they? She said, no, I'm depressed because these people have written such great stuff. I mean, it's so mind-blowing and so good. And there's no way I could ever do this. And I said, well, first of all, these people didn't start off writing like this. This is a culmination of years and years of writing. But even so, you still have one up on Tolstoy, and that is that you are alive and he is not. And you are here to comment on your world and to make sense, which is what writers do, what artists do, to try to make sense, to try to make story out of what you see. And so as writers, even when we're not consciously thinking internet, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, right? Hopefully we're not thinking of that, because I think if somebody set out to write a Facebook novel, it would be really boring, right? It's fun as an experiment. I have my classes do this. I have my classes do a Facebook page on Bartleby the Scrivener, and it becomes really funny because they're all posting. I don't know if you've ever read that story, but it's about a very weird guy who shows up at this place of work and begins to drive the owner bonkers. And so they do it as Facebook posts, and it's clever, it's fun, but I think a whole novel like this would probably be tedious, right? I think if you overthink this and try to make the translation too literal, you'll founder. The influence, I think, is more generalized. It's like something we who are writing now are breathing in and can't help but digest into different kinds of works. And I think one example of this is The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, the Junot Díaz novel. How many of you, anybody read that? It's a very, very dense book. Purposely dense, and he talks about that in several interviews. It has lots of arcane references. It has footnotes that go on for pages. It's got stream of consciousness. It's got all this sort of geek terminology that most of us don't understand. And I think, I don't think that Junot was thinking, well, this is the internet and this is all the information that we have at our disposal. I don't think he was thinking that. But that is the age we live in, right? I was talking to a class earlier today about the challenges that researchers face now, student researchers, because when I was in college, there was no internet for research, there was no Google, You went to the library like this, and you looked up what you wanted in you know, the Dewey Decimal System, and then you went to go look for the, some of us may remember this, you went to go look for the journal and it wasn't there, and you had to go and find another one and go back, and it was missing the page that you wanted. And so your research was limited to what you could get your hands on, and that was it. You know, it was no stress about what am I going to include, what am I not going to include. It was just, you know, there it is, and I'll write about that. And now, well, it explodes, right? You start off, you know, researching one thing, and the next thing you know, you're off in Bhutan, right? And with the clicks and the hypertext and so forth. And this has an effect on us, whether we realize it or not. And I think one of the effects is these very dense books. Another effect is the playfulness, right? The ludic, right? We are living in the ludic age, right, of games. That's what the internet does better than anything else, probably. And that also has an effect, right? And I love when Amy describes the book as interactive, because it's very much how I see it. As a book where, yeah, even though it's static on the page, it invites you to look things up the way I looked them up when I was writing it. Right? I mean, all of this information didn't come from my brain. First of all, I don't have that good of a memory. And so it invites the same kind of playful inquiry that went into its creation. And in doing so, it forms this kind of feedback loop where the book becomes something that continues to work like a machine almost on its own, in the best scenario, right? In the best case. And it's nothing that I sat down thinking about when I wrote it. I just knew that I wanted to be playful. I just knew that I suddenly had the whole world of information at my fingertips, and why not use it? Right? Again, we live in the world, and this is the world we have. And it's much better to relax and take what we can for our art, instead of retreat in a corner and say, no, you know, no progress, no internet. Right? My friends are always struggling with the internet while they're writing, you know, and there's all these programs to shut it down, and you have to give special passwords to get in, and you know, shut you down for a certain amount of hours and all of this. And I struggled with this myself, because I have a pretty short attention span, which is why I naturally gravitated to journalism, I think. But I struggle with this. I struggle with, you know, writing a little bit and then just clicking on something, you know, reading something, going to Pinterest, looking at some paintings, you know. And I went through all of this, you know. That's it, you know, cold turkey, no more internet. But you know, I've given in. For now, I say this is the way I write now. This is the way we write now. So just let it be. And the book that I'm working on now that it's almost finished, again, it's not something that I consciously thought of when I was writing it. Because the book itself is very influenced by the Oulipo Group and George Peric's Life, a User's Manual, which is about a apartment building in France, and it's 100 chapters, and it you know, goes in and out of different apartments, and it's a very dense book also. So it was partly influenced by that, but now that it's finished and I read it occasionally just to try to do some revisions or see where I'm going or get ideas for the next chapters. As I'm reading it, one day it struck me that it's a lot like Facebook. It's not like Facebook in the sense that, you know, people are posting selfies and, you know, telling me what they ate and that kind of stuff. I mean, that's not what these characters are doing. And it's a serious book. I mean, there's a serious thing that happens that changes things in the building and so forth. But the way we go into different lives arbitrarily, in and out, where first we're in this apartment and this is going on, and then boom, we're out, and we go to chapter 3 and it's another apartment, another day, something else going on, and then boom, you don't get to finish that train of thought and you're into another place. It's very much the way we consume story in Facebook, because this is, you know, this constant feed, everybody's got their little drama going on. They disappear for a time, they come back, right? You never get, and then you get a lot of information about certain things and absolutely nothing about others, right? And I realized that this new book does this. And it's nothing that I set out to do consciously. Again, I think if I had, it would fail, because it would be probably too obvious, tendentious. It would be more of an academic exercise. Not that there's anything wrong with academic exercises, but it's not what I wanted a novel to be, obviously. But I think I would be insincere and dishonest if I didn't say that I think the way that I consume story today influences the way that I write story. I mean, it's kind of a truism, but it's worth being upfront about, right? And instead of railing against, you know, that nasty, evil internet, to see instead what it gives us. And so before I read, there's an artist. I have a Pinterest account, which I love, and I have a board called Art for Writing. I didn't want to do PowerPoint because I hate it, so I just printed these out. And there's these artists. This one's Richard Saha, who take old tapestries. Let's see how I can show this best, so it's not in the air. He takes these old tapestries. I don't know if you can see it from there. I'll pass them around. He takes these old tapestries and he embroiders over them in these kind of hilarious things. Like this one, he embroidered a jacket with a skull on it, and this sort of clown hair on this one. He does a lot of clowns with them. And this is Jose Romusi, who takes these old photographs of ballerinas and then does this really beautiful embroidery over them. And here's another example. This is Maurizio Anzeri-Yatzer. You can see that, you know, embroidered over their faces. These are old photographs, and they're just embroidered. And first time I saw this artwork, I was just delighted, because I thought, this is what I've been doing, right? This is what all writers do, is they take the black and white facts of their life and they embroider all over it. And that becomes a novel, that becomes a short story. Or more often, in my case at least, they take the stories of other people and embroider them. My husband's become very wary of telling these stories because he grew up in Czechoslovakia, so he's got these great stories. And he tells them really well. And he thinks he can't write. He's a fantastic storyteller. And I'm always telling him, you should write these down. He's like, no, I don't want to write them down. So I use them sometimes. I'm now trying to think of how I'm going to persuade him to I want to make one of my characters a Slovak. Right now she's Polish, but it doesn't work. She needs to be Slovak, because he tells me these great stories about growing up right on the border and going up into the hills and seeing Vienna and the lights of Vienna. He talks about coming home from his grandmother's village, and it's dark and there's a glow in the sky, and his parents would say, that's Vienna, right? And it's fantastic. It like gives me chills, and I want to steal that. I want to use it. So I'm waiting for the right moment to tell him that I'm going to take it. I already took another of his stories, and I realized I was retelling it, and I told it all wrong. I told it the way that I wrote it. It happened one way, and I remembered it another, and that's how I wrote it. And so he was correcting me at dinner, at this dinner party that we had, where he was telling me. But it was a great story. He was I'll tell you the way that I'm writing it. I'm very, very superstitious about reading from new work, but I'll tell you a story that's in there from the new work, and hopefully the novel gods will not strike me down. But she's still Polish in this version, although I want to make her Slovak eventually. But she, when the wall was up, her parents would pay for English classes with honey from the family farm, and it was very clandestine. And she learned English, and she learned it really well. So when the wall fell, she was in her early 20s, the Berlin Wall happened before many of you were born, I realize. But then she goes to work for the Ministry of, I forget what I called it, Ministry of Business or something. And they have a meeting with a USAID. And USAID is trying to give them money, and she's translating for her bosses in the ministry. You know. And the bosses, this goes on for a long, long time, and they're going back and forth, and finally the boss says to her, listen, dearie, don't translate this, but we just want their money. And my husband, this happened to my husband, except very different version from what I remember. But that's okay, because I just embroidered it. And it works better the way I tell it for the purposes of my story. But these are the sorts of things that, you know, the internet has given us, right? We get story, we're bombarded with facts, and as a writer, as an artist, you literally embroider them and make them into something new. And I'm going to read a little bit from on the topic of what writers do and what artists do, and it's so grand to talk about artists and writing. I've been quoting Murakami's recent interview in these classes, and I'll quote him again here because I think this is the correct approach. He said, "I don't consider myself a creator. I consider myself more of an engineer or a gardener. You do something every day and it gives something back to you, right? You do something every day and it grows. And I think that's the best way to describe any kind of writing or work or anything that you do. So I don't want to use grand terms to do it. But I think that people who do that kind of work do it regardless of pay or glory or anything else. They do it for whatever reasons, unknown to them in a way, but because they can't do anything else in a lot of cases. George Orwell has a great quote where he says, "All writers are vain, selfish, and lazy, and at their heart of their motivation lies a mystery." You know, and I think that just about got it right. But I'll read very briefly. Well, I'll read very briefly from The Parachute Maker. Oh, I think I did this on my Kindle. Hold on. Very, very briefly. And then I just want to open it up to discussion because I've been talking all day and I'm bored of my own voice. Okay. This is The Parachute Maker. This is a town. It's a story about a town in Cuba, fictional, where it's very windy, and all the people there, what they do is they make parachutes. And they make them for the war effort. And this is actually also an embroidered story because it features a historical event, or at least semi-historical. My father, when I was growing up, my father always told the story of the Singer sewing machines. They had them leased to a bunch of people in the town. And when the Great Depression came, people were not able to pay their monthly, lease on the machines. And rather than let them keep the machines, the company came and destroyed them one by one. It's a story my dad's mother or father told him. This happened in the time of, my great-grandparents or something. And when my dad told me that story when I was young, it just haunted me. How nasty, to destroy these things that create and that people are making a livelihood from, and just because they can't get their freaking usurious fees back on these machines. And so I wanted to write about it finally, just as a way to look into it more, and I could never find anything about it. If anybody ever finds anything, please let me know. I could not find any evidence that this happened. But that didn't stop me because it's fiction, so I wrote it. And what happens is that there's a bad guy in town who has the lease to all these machines that are creating these parachutes, these envelopes. And when there's a downturn in the economy and they're not able to pay, he destroys them one by one in the yard. But the story is really about Belafonte, who's more than everybody else in the town takes this as a job, but he's obsessed with this art, and he makes these beautiful things out of the silk, these beautiful envelopes, and just does nothing else but do this. And Seraphim is the bad guy. So I have a big description of Seraphim. The story goes on, maybe a bit too long. In sum, Seraphim was not a good-looking man, and this shortcoming exacerbated his unpopularity. For as everyone knows, all sorts of sins are forgiven the beautiful. Belafonte was such a creature. He was a bit above the average height of an Aquilino, and his light, thin limbs gave him the appearance of being even taller. One never saw him plodding along in a kilo. No, Belafonte seemed to soar. To his many admirers, it seemed he was one and the same element with the wind that gamboled down those narrow streets of cobblestone. Though he was by then in his early 30s, Belafonte retained a delicate, boyish face and happy, curious eyes. It was a source of constant frustration to the mothers of the town that Belafonte had steadfastly refused marriage, preferring to spend solitary hours in his little thatched hut on the windiest bluff of Aquilo. He seemed to care for nothing else but making parachutes. And long after most of the Aquilinos had risen from their cantantes, the cantantes are the singer sewing machines, and made their way to the village center for dinner and drinks, Belafonte remained at his machine. Often, when the villagers returned home from their late night partying, they noticed that Belafonte's light was still on, and his graceful silhouette bent over his current production. They were just parachutes, but Belafonte showered them with the disproportionate love of the obsessed. Like most artists, he gave his creations much more attention than they were worth. These were, after all, only parachutes destined for distant wars, not royal boudoirs. And yet, you wouldn't know it from examining the envelopes that Belafonte produced. It's really a shame that none of these magnificent shoots survived. Every one, except his final creation, burns on the fields of Europe. What a treasure the world lost, one of many it would never know. So Belafonte, after the massacre of the sewing machines, goes off and builds a magnificent parachute and goes up high into the hills where the bad guy, Seraphim, has his prized horses, and he takes off with the horse flying away. So that's how the story ends. Now I'm going to read a little bit of the prologue to this book. Do I have any Spanish speakers in here? No. Sort of. Okay. Well, it's fun that I'm having with the Spanish language, so I'll read it and then I'll talk about it. This is written by the Irish-born Alberto Quain, who goes eventually, palms his way into a job at the National Library of Havana. And let's see, what else do you need to know? So he's just talking about growing up in Roscommon in Ireland. So let's see. Yeah, we lived on a farm at the edge of the Great Plains of Boyle. The farm had belonged to my grandfather before us, and to his father before that, and his father, in a succession that stretched all the way back to the era of the kings. My father never claimed to be descended from royalty himself, but he could recite the Quain lineage by memory to the 14th century. Quain, you may know, was once spelled in Gaelic O'Quinn, which means descendants of Conn, unless you consider the alternative spelling O'Quain, accent over the A, in which case it means descendants of Cuan. In fact, though my father seemed to have a firm grasp of who fathered whom, the name Quain itself suffered several bastardizations through the long winter of illiteracy and English atrocity. O'Quinn, McQuinn, McCuin, Quine, etc. So who's to say when Quien appeared? And then there are the other variations I discovered in my travels, cual, que, o como. And cual, que, and o como mean which, what, and how in Spanish. So that's a little bit of fun that I was having with myself. And my editor, who doesn't speak Spanish, thought this passage was going on too long with the lineage and wanted to cut out, you know, that part. So, yeah. Well, I don't know how we're doing on time. We're almost out of time, actually. So I really would like to just stop reading and talking and answer some questions or, you know, engage in some other way. I neglected, I was so overwhelmed by Amy's beautiful introduction, I neglected to thank you for inviting me. And thank you all for being here and this beautiful library, which is just a joy to be in libraries. And this fantastic weather, which is really, I'm not being ironic, it's a wonderful respite from the 87 degrees we've been having in Miami. So I'm not trying to make you jealous, I really prefer this. So Amy can commiserate, I think. It gets old, the heat. So thank you all for being here, and thank you Amy and the other people who made this possible for me to be here today. So let me open it up to you guys. Yeah.
I just introduce myself, if that's okay. I'm your English major here at Greg. I'd like to ask you sort of this is a vaguely political question. Do you feel like writers have a responsibility given that generally in the last few years the politics of the internet have been focused primarily on trying to prioritize large-scale content providers over small-scale authors?
Yeah, you know, this is a very long, a very ancient argument, actually, the role of the writer in society, right? And you will have, it's one that I don't even like to get into, because you will have people who say, you know, it's the duty of the writer to be involved in politics, not just of the internet, but just in politics, to be a force for change and good and all that. And there's people who, there was a famous exchange between, at one of the Penn International gatherings, if I had a better memory, I could remember it exactly, because I'm not going to do it justice, but it was an exchange between Salman Rushdie, I think, and John Updike. And Salman Rushdie, you know, challenged these kind of suburban writers to be more active in the atrocity, you know, condemning the atrocities that the U.S. was doing and so forth. And Updike said something like, you know, writers don't have duties, we have inspirations, or something like that. It was a very, you know, funny dust-up. I think also was it Pericles who said, just because you don't take an interest in politics doesn't mean politics won't take an interest in you. I have a lot of friends who've been active in net neutrality, for instance, in trying to keep that going. And I think, yes, of course, I mean, I wouldn't say to step away from engagement with life, right? I mean, I began this talk by saying we live in the world and we write in the world, and we cannot remove ourselves from it, and politics is part of that world, and how you as a writer address it, I think is a very personal and an idiosyncratic choice, which sounds like kind of a cop-out when I'm saying that I was a columnist for 3 years in Miami, writing a lot about politics, and I am a bit gun-shy now to have a lot of public opinions, because that is something that has changed. The internet has changed for the worse. Trolls, and it's become a very big issue for women writers, especially. And yeah, I'm tired, you know. And so, you know, one of the ways that you can support, you know, open access and things like that is to write about it. I'm a member of Penn International. I also participate when I can in their efforts to you know, free writers who've been imprisoned and so forth. And I think that's very important. And that is an issue that's very close to my heart. And I was involved in an event at the book fair, Miami Book Fair, some years ago, where Penn International put together a panel, and people were going to read different works of theirs in support of freedom of expression. And what I did with my time is I read the list of every single writer and journalist who's imprisoned around the world. And it took about, the 20 minutes that I was allotted. And it was one of the most powerful readings I've ever done, because you put a name, you utter a name, and the word becomes flesh in that sense, and it's very powerful. And I think that when you can do that as a writer, it's very good. But again, it has to be something that's it cannot be felt as a duty. I'm very afraid of shoulds. I said to somebody today, somebody was asking me, what books should I read? And I said, should sounds like medicine, And I think it's more, it has to be something that comes out of you, something that you desire to participate in. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you always know that you wanted to be a writer in some degree, whether it was as a columnist or as an author, and what was the clincher that you was like, this is what I want to do?
Oh, you're tempting me to tell another really long story. This is my problem, I can't let it go without a big long story. I always knew I wanted to be a storyteller because I got a lot of joy out of it. I got pleasure out of telling stories, and especially of telling stories that would make people laugh. And I was a kid who at lunch came with stories to tell. And so I knew that I was always going to tell stories in some form or another. My uncle is a very well-known and well-regarded poet. He's not writing anymore, unfortunately. He's had some health issues, but he was a huge influence on me from a very young age. And of course, as the children of exiles, you are constantly being told stories. That's all you have. My family, even before Cuba, my great-grandparents were from Lebanon and Syria. So generations of migrations means that all you have to take with you is stories. We don't have family heirlooms. We just have the stories. And so that also was just part of the way that we interacted with each other. And everything that I knew about Cuba was a story. I didn't know Cuba. Cuba was a fantasy land. And so I'll try to tell the story very quickly. I think when I knew that I wanted to tell stories for good, I was about 14 years old, and I wanted a summer job, and my mother wouldn't let me have a summer job. So your job is to study. And I said, I want a summer job, I want my own money, I want to be independent. And so this went on from weeks and weeks and weeks, and we're going in the mall one day with my grandmother, her mother, my mother, and me. And there used to be a company called the Original Cookie Company, and they made cookies in all the malls. And they have a help wanted sign. I said, I'm going to apply. And my mom's just been worn down by this time. And she said, fine, go. And the manager happened to be there that day, sort of middle-aged dude. And he says, oh yeah, I'll come in, I'll interview you. And he takes, I'm 14, I was about the same height I am now, I guess, more or less. So I was, older looking for my age. And so he takes me to this deserted part of the mall. They're like under construction or something. And he proceeds to, it was nothing inappropriate, but it was just a really long interview. And he's talking about how they make cookies and how you make them crispy and how you make them soft, and just on and on and on and on. And so it went on for a very long time, and finally we're done, and we're walking back, and as we're walking back to the food court, I see just a mass of people and like mall security, and in the middle of it is my mother and my grandmother screaming that this guy, some guy just took me, and what kind of job interview is this, and making just the worst kind of Cuban embarrassing show. And I was absolutely mortified. And 14, think back when you're 14, it's the end of the world. I'll never be able to show my face here again. They've humiliated me. They're thwarting my independence. I mean, it was just the end of the world. And I went, we went back in silence, and I was just so mad. And the next day at school, I told the story. And as I was telling it, I see people starting to laugh. And I'd embellish it a little bit more, and they'd laugh more, and I had this whole conversation that went on, and the whole thing, and the whole table was in tears, laughing. And I thought, wow, that's nice, right? And not only is it nice because you have this power to make people laugh, to have an emotional reaction to people, right? This is what Tolstoy said is art, by the way. And he says, human beings are uniquely able to see a man crying and feel sadness, right? So that in itself was power. But also, what power of transformation to take an event that was mortifying and horrible and turn it into something fun, just by story. It's like magic. And I was hooked. And I knew then that no matter what I ended up doing, I was going to tell stories in one way or the other, whether as a journalist, whether as a fiction writer, poet, whatever. I just knew that I was going to do it. Filmmaker. I wanted to be a filmmaker for a long time. I still do in a way, There's still stuff that I want to do. It's not too late, I guess. So yeah, I always did, and I always loved reading, so.
Have you been able to practice when you're writing more about technology, like the books that you're writing on Facebook? Did you write that on Facebook and now you just see that it's similar, or?
That's a good question. I think that'd be a good topic for academics actually to look into, for people who know literary theory and can really think about these things in a way that I think writers are not trained to. I always had a disjointed style to my writing. Part of it is my general distractedness, I guess, but also my journalism training probably. But this is the first book where I return to a story after many pages, because my first book is they're short stories, they're interrelated, and the characters sometimes show up in the other stories, but there's not a continuous storyline. In this book, there are continuous storylines that are broken up. And I'm not sure it's totally fair to say it's influenced by Facebook, but I think it has a flavor. It has something of the scent that's in the air. And I think it's not conscious, but it is inevitable. And I think more and more we'll see writing evolving, according to the times. I mean, the novel came out in the 19th century with serialization in a way. We have Don Quixote, which was the first one, but it really hit its stride because of technology, because they could distribute these magazines and serialize them, and then the novel developed to meet that particular development. And I think this will always be true. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship that writers have with the societies that they live in, and I think it's impossible to not be influenced by trends, including trends in technology. Yeah.
So it seems that you're pretty involved in global issues. That makes me really like news media. Any difference in the way it's being treated in different countries around the world?
You mean in terms of fiction in new media, or or internet access and things like that?
Just in general.
I don't know so much. I mean, of course, the internet is heavily regulated in many countries because the totalitarian countries realize the power that lie in them. You can do enormous things with Twitter, for instance, in terms of getting flash mobs together, and that played a huge role in the Arab Spring. The fact that the people had this other way of communicating made a huge difference. And of course, there were huge crackdowns also with that. Shut down Facebook for a while. The university where I taught, the American University in Cairo, I think they had some of their servers were disabled for a while. They recognize the power. It's been a big issue in China, of course. Yeah, and Google has complied with them too often. Yeah. Somebody else around here had.
Your activity when you're talking about, having homeland, and I was wondering if you ever, during the process of writing or after completing the text, did you ever imagine it as living on the internet in some way, or through electronics, or did you always see it as being printed on the page?
I knew that it would be in Kindle, for instance, but you know, I don't like it in Kindle. I just bought it in Kindle because I was coming here. And by doing so, I doubled my ebook sales, I'm sure. But I don't like it so much in Kindle because the footnotes, for instance, are not on the bottom of the page. You have to click on the little number, and that just ruins it, because who's going to do that? I mean, I never do that. I hardly even look at footnotes to begin with, and so I don't like that about it. And also the layout is sometimes weird in the Kindle. So I knew it was going to be in Kindle, and you know, in the internet, I had this idea that people would translate. There's a story in Spanish. And so what I did is I put the translation on my website, the translation to English on my website. So, but very minor, you know, kind of baby steps. I think what's happening with a lot of new media now is analogous to what happened to TV when it first started. And so many TV shows were just like radio shows, and just people standing there talking behind a microphone, because it took people a while to figure out, hey, wait a minute, this is totally different, and we can do a bunch of other stuff that we weren't able to do. So there's a lag time between, you know, the technology and then what people figure out that they can do with it. And we are in that time now. So to the extent that this lives on the internet, it's a very sort of, you know, baby steps and kind of irrelevant, you know, not cutting edge in any way in that sense. Yeah.
Do you think that women are dealing with the same struggles in the realm of media literature as they did in like traditional literature?
You know, I don't know enough to say.
Like in the new age.
Yeah, I don't know enough to say. I know that Pry is a collaboration between a woman and a man. They did this thing together. I think that they're able to be part of more collaborative efforts, but I really don't know. That's also a good thing to study, you know, how they're doing in new media. I know that that opinion writers who are women have a very, very, very hard time on the internet, much more so than men, in terms of personal attacks and threats and harassment and things like that. And it becomes very personal, and that's been very unfortunate. I've had several friends who write who've had to get restraining orders against, you know, people who are stalking them. And they tend to be very sexualized attacks, of course, and you know, not about your thoughts, but you know, you look like a horse or whatever, you know. I mean, you get that. So it's one of the unfortunate things, and one hopes that that this is just kind of a fluke of new technology, and that it will find its level at some point.
I've heard that gaming can be really hostile toward women too, and a lot of you guys are going to know more about this than I do, but some of the stories I've heard are
right. Yeah. Like Anita Sarkeesian's sort of feminist frequency videos, and the fact that she had to move out of her own home because the response is just, she had to cancel speaking engagements because the response is so vile.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very dark side of what we've created. Yeah, and it's also something that was always there, obviously. When I was a columnist, there was a lag between when I frequently quit my journalism jobs and promise never to come back, and then I do. And so there's this, I've been able to track the development or devolvement of journalism. And between my last journalism job and my columnist job, that was the biggest change, was the harassment. Because you know, we had email at the very end of when I was working, but it wasn't really used that much. And you know, you'd get nasty phone calls, which I used to get, but it was not, it was proportional. I mean, it wasn't anything that, boy, you know, once people could leave comments on you know, anonymous comments on the end of columns, what's the point of that? I mean, that's like telling people they can come and graffiti your building with, you know, racist and misogynist things and not leave. Yeah, why? What value is that in there? And I used to fight, you know, my bosses, because they at one point had a policy where you had to respond to every email. I was like, well, no, I'm not responding to somebody who's calling me a cunt. Sorry for recording this, but you know, I'm not. You know, that person's not getting a response from me, and that was a very frequent thing that I was called as a female columnist. There was a blog that was stalking me basically and saying somebody needs to take Anna Menendez behind the woodshed and bitch slap her. These sorts of things. And it's one of the reasons I left. And, you know, there's all this hand-wringing, or there was at the time, about how few women opinion writers there are. And I said, well, it's not the fault, it's not that newspapers don't want to hire women, I don't think, because they're generally very sensitive to this. It's that women don't want to do this job. Often because the newspapers don't back them up also, you know. But also it's, you know, it takes a very strong person, and who's willing to dedicate themselves, and who has strong beliefs, and is willing to you know, put her sanity on the line. And I just wasn't that person, you know. Unfortunately, because I think more women need to stick it out. You know, maybe they can. Are we out of time? Yeah. So.
Join me again and thank you.
Thank you.